Sorry for the interruption. Somebody was trying to Skype me. Anyway, so if we take a look at the style, there we can see we've got a width of 300 pixels, a margin of 0.5 EMs, a line height of 1.5. We have a float left, padding of 0.5, and then a border of 1 solid pixel. That's 333 is the color, which is probably, I think it's a dark gray. So we look at this, we can see that what we've got is this one's float left and these float left, and then this one basically is on like a new page. That one's kind of floating onto a new page. So that's kind of what's going on there. The problem with floats sometimes is we have a hard time controlling them, and sometimes we need to clear out the floats, and we'll see that here in a little bit, where we can go ahead and clear out a float in order to basically make the page look nice. That really does not look well at all. But again, as you can see, we can have things float, and they will float very, very nice, especially when I start shrinking the screen down and we start dealing with this thing called responsive. Okay, so continuing on, so we want to lay out our pages with this float, and here we've basically got some code. We're going to have this page that looks like this. It's kind of we'll kind of call it somewhat of a resume. And if we take a look at the example here, this is basically what it looks like. And again, if I shrink it down, you can see that the page basically, everything kind of starts rolling into place, and everything basically looks the way it should. We've got a picture that's floated. We got some text that is floated as well. So we go back to the actual code. We can see that we've got a nav tag. We have an ID tag, what's called about. We've got an ID, which is a role main. And so let's take a look at the actual CSS code. And there we've got a, well, it's probably in the text itself, so it's just got the body tag. Let's take a look at the actual code. Okay, so there we have, wow, I don't have much in the way of style, do we? We've basically got no style, so So basically what we're looking at is a page with no style on it. It basically, even though it's pointing to a style sheet, it's basically got nothing in there except for some padding and some margins and that type of thing. So let's take a look at the next one, which is this 12.5. I think that's where we get more, yeah. So now we basically have more of a CSS going on here. So if we take a look at that CSS, okay, now we basically have some code that we can kind of look at. So here's what we've got. We've got body, which basically has looks like we got our font set, we got our font size, we got our line height, we got our color. We've got an H1 tag. We basically changed the font and the font size. We've got a unordered list, which is list style none, which means no bullet points. We have a sidebar, that's a pound sign, so that is an ID tag. We have a pound sign main, which is also an ID tag. We also have a pound sign footer, which also is an ID tag. So our sidebar says float left. Our width is 27%. Our margin is top. We've got padding. We're basically using this shadow box. And we also so we got that basically that shadow effect on our border. Our main, we've got a top, we've got a margin left, we've got a border top, padding 15%. That's all the way around. So if we don't specify left, right, whatever, and we just have one number in there, since I don't have 4 sets of numbers, that means it's going to be 15% all the way around. It also has a shadow. We've got a footer. Now this one has got a clear. I talked about clear earlier. What that does is that clears out any floats that are going on. So if you have a float left or float right, it basically clears those out and kind of starts the page fresh. So it's going to basically be left aligned, and everything's going to be basically kind of defaulted back the way it was before we had any floats. So if we take a look at the code itself, we're going to see that here I've got my sidebar. Again, it's an ID tag. We've got an ID nav, which again, the nav means no bullet points because we've turned those off. And here's our UL list. And then I've got my main, ID main. Now again, since I have the float turned on and it's only this wide, that main's going to automatically pick up on the right-hand side of that particular float. Then our footer down here, again, we've cleared out any floats that are going on, so that footer is going to then just basically be just normal text. And that's where we basically get it to look like this. Okay, so there's our H1 tag, here's our left sidebar, here's our main, and notice here is our footer. Notice we got the border with that shadow box basically in there as well. Okay, and our padding, make sure that we have a little bit of padding between the line and the actual text itself. Okay, looks okay, not too bad. So let's take a look at some more. So if we start playing around with it, if we did not have the clear tag in the footer, it would basically look like this. The footer would then just go ahead and go right behind the main. Now if this main had a lot more text in it, that footer might be left aligned down below. Okay, so that's kind of what this particular code right here is basically discussing, is how we can clear out the footer. Clear both means clear any of the left or right floats that are in there, and then it will basically be left aligned like it should anyways. Two-column fixed layout. We can actually make the columns have the same width or different widths and make sure they have the same height. Notice here we don't have any padding on this one. Notice how the text is butted right up against the border. Doesn't look good at all. It looks very, very terrible. And here we don't have this set up in columns. Well, then we tried setting it up in columns where this tag, this border overlays that border. We don't want that. But the text kind of basically still think of it as still respects the float, so the text is there but the border doesn't. That looks terrible. We could basically have our archives, our menu bar up here. I think I have that as an example. Yeah, we had this one, which, yeah, again, notice it's down here, the footer's down here. They're somewhat of the same height. Looks okay. Not too bad. If we go back and look at 11, again, this is what we're looking at right here. There's a lot of white space right here. So we'll want to do something with this menu bar a little differently. So what we'll want to do is something like this. Well, not like this, but there we kind of got them stacked one on top of each other. We don't want that either. So kind of what we're looking for is, again, and notice the text is butted up against the menu. Really, that looks terrible. So they keep playing around with different things, and it's not working the way they try moving it over here and floating this all on the other side. And again, so what they're trying to do is show you things not to do, and all of these different. So here we got float, or we've got a wrapper. So here's what we're trying to do: is we're trying to have this thing called a wrapper, and we've got a main border around everything, and so everything's kind of contained inside this wrapper. So we can set kind of some code around the wrapper, so everything else that kind of is inside of the wrapper kind of inherits what the wrapper has. Again, our wrapper is not big enough. This one here shows a wrapper. It's not big enough to hold all the text. We made the height too small. And this is where we have a wrapper, and the wrapper it has no border, and then the footer is outside of the wrapper. So we've got this thing called CSS frameworks. So CSS frameworks is a predefined set of files that includes, among other things, a layout system that makes it easy to quickly construct a complex multi-column layout. So right here it says, while simple layouts are easy to construct with floats, complex layouts can quickly become quite hairy, and that's where CSS framework can come in handy. So think of a framework as what we build our house with. We build our house with studded walls and 2x4s, and that's the framework that kind of holds up the roof and holds up our walls, and then there's a framework. So we have this kind of the same thing with our web page as well. We can set up this framework that we can then create sidebars and mains, and maybe we might have a right bar. We have headers and footers and different things kind of going on there. We have a grid system. The frameworks we use a grid system. The layout comprises of a grid of a number of same-size columns, which serve as building blocks for constructing sections of the web page. So we have this blueprint framework. To better understand this, let's take a look at the blueprint framework. It's a 24-column system where each column is 30 pixels wide and 10 pixels in a gutter. Gutter meaning a margin. It says I want to divide my layout into 4 parts: a header that spans the width of the container, the first and last sidebar span 6 columns, and the middle content has a span of 8 columns. So it basically looks like this. We have a div class of container, and then inside that we have a class that spans 24, a class that spans 6, or that's the name of it: span 24, span 6, span 12, and then we have a span 6 last. So if we take a look at that guy, that was 19. So if we take a look at that guy, this is basically what it looks like. So we've got a nice header and we've got 3 columns. So it really looks nice. If we take a look at the source, so here we have we're using a blueprint screen CSS. We're using a CSS blueprint print CSS. We'll talk about print CSS in just a second. And we have a CSS style.css. Print CSSs are really nice. You can have a CSS just for printing a page. And what you can then do is when somebody prints that page, it will follow the CSS of the print CSS. Okay. And so it basically has, so notice the difference between this style sheet has media, screen, and projection. This one has a media of print, and this one has a screen and projection. So we have 2 for just normal display on a web page, and we have 1 specifically just for printing. We do have an if less than IE8. We want to use a different style sheet. So we got a class container. Here's our span 24, span 6, span 12, span 6. If we go ahead and look at the style sheet, so here's the style sheet. It just has a background color of teal, that's the header, and then the header has the H1 color of FFF, which is basically white. So we basically go into the blueprint now and we look at the, what was it? It was CSS blueprint screen, okay. So we take a look at this and whoa, there's a lot of stuff here. So here is our HTML. This just kind of does everything. More HTML, which was our font. Labels, wow. So here's our spans. So here's what's nice is this CSS we can just bring in, and it's basically kind of a generic, kind of a catch-all. So we're using the 12, which is a width 470. You're using the 6, which is a width 230. I think we're using the 24, which is a 950, and it has a margin of 0. So what's nice is we can use just the spans that we want to use within our particular website. These are all within a, these are all dots, which are classes. So they're using a class file. So what's kind of nice is we can grab this blueprint CSS, throw it into our particular web page, and just utilize it however we want. Just pick out the pieces that we want to use. Wow, we got a whole bunch. Here's an append. Here's pull, push. So there's a whole lot of stuff kind of that comes with it that we can utilize. Again, we don't have to use it all. We can just use the pieces that we want. And that's what we've done here. So pretty cool stuff. And again, here's all the different spans it was talking about. Wow, look at this. So here we can use a 12-column grid. Here's some fancy heading. I mean, here's the sidebar, and look at that. We've got nice little. So through CSS, we can actually set each one of these columns up, and then basically clear it out, and basically then create here's one that spans all three. We got 3 columns, so we can get as complex as we need to. The 960 grid system says, let's briefly contrast Blueprint with another popular grid-based framework, which is the 960 grid. The 960 grid system uses a 12 or 16 column grid, depending on your preferences. And the 12 column grid, the columns are 60 pixels wide. The 16 column grid has a 40 pixel column. Okay, so we can basically pick and choose what we want to use in order to basically get those to basically show up. Okay, so this guy here up here was using the Blueprint, where we can just grab the particular span that we need to span whatever column that is, and then we can go on from there. And we can have just a border on the right or border on the left, whatever we need. So here's probably got a border on the right, border on the right. This one has a border on the right. This one has a border on the right. So this guy has the same width as these 3 together. So here's a 12-column grid, 3-column slider, 6-column div, 3-column sidebar. Okay, so really, really neat to bring those CSSs in and then utilize them. Just pick the pieces out that we need. So Blueprint and the 960 grid systems are great representatives of grid-based framework, though note that there are quite a few popular frameworks out there, each with their own collection of CSS files and libraries. So next thing we're going to talk about is this thing called responsive layouts. We're going to have a whole chapter we talk about responsive. And I talked about this in previous chapters. Responsive means as I shrink and grow this screen, how does it fit into the media that we're using? We could be looking at this on a cell phone, we could be looking on a tablet, we could be looking on it in a netbook or a laptop or a projecting it on a big screen TV. Whatever the case may be, we want responsive to basically say, I'm going to fill the screen with, and I'm going to know how big the screen is, and I'm going to fill it properly. So here's some examples. The New York Times. Again, we look at this on a tablet, we look on a cell phone, whatever the case may be. So, here's some media types for CSS for printing. It talks about some different CSSs you can bring in for those as well. CSS3 extends. So CSS3 is that's the latest and greatest CSS that goes along with HTML5. Extends the concept of media types to check for particular screen sizes. So here we have media screen and minimum width of 480 pixels. So what we're saying there is, I'm looking at media screen. It can't be any smaller than 480 pixels. That's as small as we're going to go. And then we can put our CSS rules in between there. And we'll see what those look like here in just a second. Media screen and minimum width is 480, minimum width is 600, 760. So it says in this manner we can tell the browser to deliver CSS rules to the browser only if the viewpoint or browser windows are at least 480. So it knows if the minimum width of that browser is 480, it will go ahead and apply these CSS rules. If the minimum width is 600, it will apply these rules. Minimum width is 768, it'll basically do this. 910, it will do that as well. Okay. So here's kind of what it looks like. So here is the 480. Here's the next width, the next width, and the next width. And we can see how they basically kind of look on all of those different medias. So how do we utilize this? Well, if we take a look at this particular item right here, It's just a standard. It's got two boxes of the same height, same width. They have two different colors in them. One's 600 pixels, one's 300 pixels. So what we want to do is, again, if I resize this, watch what happens when I resize it. It's going to basically truncate that item because we've told it they have a fixed width size. Okay. So what can we do instead? Well, we can go in and say the width is 100%. That's 100% of the screen you're using. So here's what we've done is, how do we figure out what size do we want? Well, if I had this set at 960 pixels wide, which is what we did up here, we set the width to 960. Then within that I set this to 600 and this to 300, and there's 60 pixels in between there. So if I want to figure out what's the percentage I want, I take 960 and divide by 600. That gets me 6.625. Okay, which is 62.5%. I do the same thing with the was it 300, and that gets me 31.25%. So now if I change this to 100%, got to be 100% wide. The other one's 62.5 and 61 or 31.25. If I take a look at this guy, that's what it looks like. So it's basically taken up 100%. Now watch what happens when I resize this. Notice everything keeps shrinking down. Okay, each one of those is taking up 62.5 and 31.25. So kind of nice. So that's kind of the basis for responsive. If we take a look at 12.27, again, if I resize it, again, this is getting back to the responsive. Notice that we actually lose the color, and it basically just drops one underneath the other. Okay. If we take a look at the text for that, so here notice I've got my at media screen. The minimum width is 910. So we have these. We're going to use these div containers, and these div containers are only going to basically appear when our minimum width is within the 910 pixel range. When it's no longer in the 910 pixel range, these particular div tags are no longer used. Okay, and that's when you notice one slipped underneath the other one, and we basically lost our color as well. Notice that we had this background color and this background color. When we dropped below 910 pixels, we lost all of that, and the text then just appeared however the HTML basically displayed it. If I made that 600, well, it's not going to work because I don't have it. But anyways, I could make it narrower, and it would basically do the same thing as well. So, and that's kind of what this particular item here is basically doing. It's showing that we've got, here's our container, and within our container we had the, I got too many things open here. Yeah, so within this container, if that is true, the div container is going to work, the div main and the div aside is going to work. So here I've got my container. Here is my div content, and here is my div sidebar. And again, when it drops below 910, it's no longer used. And here we have, so let's take a look at, now this picture is not going to match up what the code basically was utilizing, but let's take a look at it anyway. So if we look at this last one, this is basically what it looks like. Okay, so we've got a header, we've got a menu bar, we've got some text with a picture, we've got a sidebar. And when I click on the resize and I start resizing this, watch what happens. All of a sudden you notice that the menu just stacks on top of each other and the sidebar basically drops down to the bottom. Okay, so we can actually resize this to fit any type of a screen, whether it be a cell phone, whether it be a tablet, whatever the case may be. And if we take a look at the CSS for that, it's got quite a few different CSSs, but if we take a look at the CSS, we're going to see a lot of percentages going on here. Okay, now let's take a look at the book. So here we've got padding of 3%, 0%, 3%, and 5%. Again, percentages are the way to go now, because we don't want to have a fixed size. We now want a percentage. We want each one to take up a percentage. Besides getting a small bottom margin to our image, the only thing note we have done is a max width of 100%. Okay, so here we've got a max width of 100%. At some point it's going to drop. So here it is. So here we've got our media only and the minimum device width. So if the max width is 320 and the max width, or the minimum width is 320 and the max width is 480, we've got some different styles. So here are a minimum width of 321. We can put our styles in. The maximum width of 320, we can put some styles in. So again, we can get very, very specific to the size of the item. And again, as we shrink that screen down, it keeps going into popping into one of these styles to basically make it work. Okay. Papa Bear, site designed for screens wider than 1600. Mama Bear, site designed for screens 650 to 1600. Baby Bear, site designed for things up to 650. So that's kind of a neat way to think about it. So here's some different CSSs that we can basically kind of right here at this adapt 960. If we go to that website, it kind of gives us some CSSs to kind of look at and utilize. So I think that's about all we're going to cover. Again, look at the code. There's some the sample codes out there. Look at the code, play around with it, utilize it, see how it works. I'm not expecting you to know everything about responsive, everything that's doing in those CSSs, but just realize that the things we can, again, I'm always a firm believer in copying and basically borrowing code and then modifying it the way I want it to. If I find something that works, copy that into my code and then basically modify it to the way that I want it to look. Okay, we will see you next chapter.